They said if you saw her eyes, you were already too late. The air inside Dock 17 tasted like overheated circuits and recycled oxygen, dry enough to sting the back of Ethan Cole's throat as he stepped over a scattered line of abandoned tools, his boots echoing softly against the metal floor, every sound too loud in the kind of silence that meant something had already gone wrong. His scanner flickered at his wrist, glitching in and out like it didn't want to admit what was ahead. And then he saw her, standing at the far end of the bay, perfectly still, among the dim emergency lights, tall, at least 7 feet. Her silhouette outlined in a faint, shifting glow that didn't belong to any human technology, her skin catching the light in shades of deep turquoise, and something almost iridescent beneath it, like oil on water, and for a second his brain refused to process it as a person at all. He'd heard the stories, everyone had, whispered over cheap drinks and long shifts. The alien woman no one approached, the one who didn't negotiate, didn't hesitate, didn't care, the one even security teams avoided unless they had no other choice. And yet there she was, not moving, not speaking, just watching, and the worst part was he could feel it, that gaze, like standing too close to a live wire. The hum of something powerful and unpredictable pressing against his skin. Ethan's pulse climbed fast, 90, 110, 130 beats per minute. His suit picking it up and offering a quiet warning, he ignored as he forced himself to breathe slow, mechanical, the way he did when a reactor threatened to overload, because panic didn't fix systems, and it wouldn't fix this. A faint hiss broke the silence as something behind her shifted. No sudden motion, no chaos, just a subtle change, like the room itself had decided to move around her, and Ethan realized with a cold, precise clarity that whatever had happened here had ended before he arrived, and she had been the center of it. Every instinct told him to turn around, to walk back out the way he came in. Pretend this section of the station didn't exist, because that was what people did. That was how you survived around her. You stayed small, stayed distant, stayed invisible. But his feet didn't move, and he hated that part of himself, the part that always needed to understand how things worked, even when understanding might cost him everything. Her head tilted slightly, just enough for the light to catch her eyes, and for a moment the entire world narrowed to that single detail. Gold, not flat or dull but alive, like molten metal held just below the surface, focused entirely on him, measuring, calculating, deciding. Ethan swallowed, his mouth dry, his voice staying where it was because he knew better than to fill a silence that wasn't his to break. And then, against every warning he'd ever been given, he lifted his chin and met her gaze head-on. The station seemed to hold its breath with him, the distant hum of generators fading into something quieter, more fragile, like the pause before a storm decided whether to break. And in that suspended moment, Ethan realized something that didn't fit any of the stories. Something small and dangerous and impossible to ignore. She hadn't moved toward him, hadn't raised a weapon, hadn't done anything at all except watch. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that made his chest tighten more than anything else. The distance between them felt measured in inches and miles at the same time. The kind of space where one wrong move could mean everything and nothing all at once. And Ethan became suddenly aware of every small detail his body betrayed. The slight tremor in his fingers, the heat building under his collar, the quiet mechanical hum of his suit trying to stabilize his breathing while his mind kept circling the same impossible question. Why is she not moving? Her gaze did not waver, those molten gold eyes fixed on him with a precision that felt less like anger and more like analysis, as if she were studying a system that did not behave the way it was supposed to. And for a long second he wondered if he had already made a mistake just by standing there, if the stories had left something out, some invisible line he had already crossed without knowing it. A faint flicker ran across her skin, subtle but unmistakable, like light shifting beneath glass, and Ethan's instincts sharpened, not toward fear exactly but toward awareness. The same feeling he got when a machine started behaving unpredictably, not broken, just different. And different was always harder to fix. He forced his shoulders to stay relaxed, even as every muscle wanted to pull tight, and slowly, carefully, he lifted one hand, palm open, empty, the universal sign he had used 100 times in negotiations with people who trusted him far less than they should have. Except this was not negotiation, Not really, because there was no leverage here, no advantage, just a choice to stay or leave, and for reasons he could not explain, leaving felt worse. Her head tilted again, a fraction more this time, and something in her expression shifted, not softer, not warmer, just less certain, like a calculation returning a result she did not expect. And then she moved, not toward him in a rush, not with sudden force, but with a controlled step that closed half the distance between them, smooth and deliberate, her presence pressing into the space around him until it felt thinner, tighter, harder to breathe. Ethan's pulse spiked again, but he did not step back, did not break eye contact, even when every warning in his head screamed that this was exactly how people ended up as stories told in low voices. The air between them carried a faint metallic scent, sharper now, mixed with something cooler, almost like rain before it hit hot pavement. And he realized it was coming from her, from the faint energy that seemed to cling to her skin, a constant, quiet reminder that she was not built like anything he understood. She stopped just out of reach, close enough that he could see the fine details now, the way the light traced along the contours of her face, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest, slower than his, steadier, controlled. And for the first time he noticed something else, a disruption in that control, a slight irregularity, like a system running under strain. Her voice, when it came, was lower than he expected, steady but edged with something he could not name. "You should have left," she said, each word precise, measured, like they had been chosen carefully rather than spoken freely. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his lungs easing just enough for him to answer without his voice breaking. "Yeah, I probably should have," he admitted, a faint, humorless edge slipping in despite himself. But something here looked off. His eyes flicked briefly, not away from her, but past her, toward the silent, abandoned bay, the scattered tools, the systems that had shut down too cleanly to be an accident, and then back to her. "And I fix things that do not make sense." And for a moment, just a moment, the light in her eyes shifted again, not brighter, not dimmer, just different, as if the idea itself had reached something inside her that the rest of the station had not. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, as if the station itself was listening, trying to understand why a human would choose confusion over survival. And Ethan felt it too, that subtle shift in pressure, the kind that came before systems either stabilized or failed completely. Her gaze did not leave him, but something behind it changed, not the sharp edge of danger, not the quiet weight of control, but a flicker of something less certain, something that did not fit the stories he had been told, and it made his chest tighten in a way he could not explain. She took another step, slow, deliberate, until the space between them was reduced to barely 2 feet, close enough that he could feel the faint heat radiating from her, not like a flame but like stored energy, contained, restrained, and barely held in place. And for a moment, he wondered how long it had been since anyone had stood this close to her without trying to run or fight. "You fix things," she repeated, her voice quieter now, not weaker, just different, like she was testing the shape of the words. And Ethan nodded once, keeping his movements minimal, predictable. "That is the job," he said, then added after a second, "most of the time, because this did not feel like a job. Not really. This felt like stepping into something that did not follow the usual rules." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if she were examining him the way he examined damaged systems, looking for flaws, inconsistencies, anything that would explain why he was still here. And for the first time Ethan realized that she did not understand him any more than he understood her. A soft, irregular pulse flickered along her side, almost hidden beneath the shifting light of her skin, and his attention caught on it instantly, instinct overriding fear the way it always did when something needed fixing. Because irregular meant unstable, and unstable meant it could get worse. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, weighing the decision, because pointing out a flaw in something that powerful felt like a bad idea, but ignoring it felt worse, and he had never been good at ignoring problems. "You are running something too hot," he said finally, his voice steady even as his pulse disagreed. And her reaction was immediate, not outward, not explosive, but internal, a tightening he could see in the slight shift of her posture, The way the light across her skin stuttered for just a moment before smoothing out again. Silence followed, thicker this time, heavier, and Ethan held his ground, resisting the urge to explain, because explanations came after trust, and trust was not something he had earned yet. "You should not be able to see that," she said after a long pause, her tone carrying something new now, not threat, not warning, but something closer to confusion, and Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "Most people are not looking for it," he replied, his eyes flicking briefly to the faint pulse again before returning to her face. "They are too busy being afraid." And there it was, the smallest break in the pattern, the tiniest shift in her expression, like a crack forming in something that had been solid for a very long time. And for the first time since he had stepped into Dock 17, Ethan had the strange, impossible thought that maybe the most dangerous thing about her was not what she could do, but how long she had been alone while doing it. The silence did not break. It shifted, like pressure redistributing through a system that had just been touched in the wrong place. And Ethan could feel it in the air, in the way her presence tightened instead of lashing out, controlled but strained, like something designed never to fail now running closer to its limit than it should. Her eyes stayed locked on him, but the certainty inside them flickered, not gone, just interrupted, and that was enough for him to know he had been right. Whatever was happening inside her was not supposed to be visible, not to someone like him, not to anyone at all. "Who taught you to see that?" she asked, and this time there was no threat in the question, only a quiet edge of something sharper than fear, something closer to caution, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, slow, deliberate, keeping his movements predictable as he glanced once more toward the faint pulse along her side, the irregular rhythm that refused to settle. "No one," he said, his voice steady, grounded in habit more than confidence. "Machines do not hide problems well if you know where to look." He paused, then added, softer, "And neither do people." And for a moment the words seemed to land somewhere deeper than he expected, because her gaze did not harden. It stilled, like something inside her had stopped moving entirely. A faint distortion shimmered across her skin again, more noticeable now that he was looking for it, a ripple that did not match the rest of her controlled, almost perfect stillness, and Ethan's instincts leaned forward, overriding the part of his brain that kept whispering, "This is not your problem," because it never had been, not when something could be fixed, not when something was breaking right in front of him. "If it spikes again, it is going to cascade," he said carefully, choosing each word like he was stepping across unstable ground. "And I do not think your system is built to handle that kind of feedback." Her head tilted just slightly, the motion slower this time, more deliberate, and he could see it now, the gap between what she was supposed to be and what she was becoming, the hesitation, the delay, the almost human pause before a response. "You assume I require assistance," she said, but the statement lacked its earlier certainty, as if even she was not fully convinced, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. "No," he replied, meeting her eyes again, steady despite the way his pulse still pressed against his ribs. "I assume you do not like things breaking." And that was when it happened, not a dramatic shift, not some visible collapse, just a single moment where her gaze softened by a fraction so small most people would have missed it, but Ethan did not, because he was already looking for the smallest inconsistencies, the slightest deviations from the expected pattern, and this was something entirely new. The hum in the air dipped, almost imperceptibly, as if whatever energy she carried had pulled back just enough to let the space between them breathe again. And for the first time since he had walked into Dock 17, Ethan realized he could take a full breath without feeling like the air itself might push back. She did not step away, did not lower her guard entirely, but something in her stance shifted, less like a barrier and more like a question, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that same unfamiliar hesitation. "If you are wrong," she said quietly, "you will not have time to regret it." And Ethan nodded once, accepting that without argument, because that part, at least, made sense. "Then I should probably not be wrong," he answered, and for a brief second, just a flicker, something almost like curiosity passed through her eyes, and in that fragile, impossible moment, the most dangerous presence on the station did not look like a threat. She looked like a problem waiting to be understood. The moment stretched thin between them, fragile in a way Ethan had never experienced before, like a structure holding under stress not because it was strong, but because nothing had pushed it far enough yet, and he knew, with the quiet certainty that came from years of fixing things on the edge of failure, that whatever happened next would decide everything. The faint irregular pulse along her side flickered again, slightly stronger this time, and he saw it clearly now, not just a glitch, not just an anomaly, but a pattern building towards something larger, something her control was barely containing, and his instincts sharpened, not with fear, but with focus, because this was the part that mattered, the moment where hesitation either saved you or cost you everything. "It is getting worse," he said, his voice low but steady, not accusing, not alarmed, just stating a fact the way he always did when systems started to fail. And her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because she could feel it too. Whatever was happening inside her was no longer small enough to ignore. The air around her shimmered more noticeably now, subtle distortions bending the light at the edges of her form, and Ethan took a slow breath, grounding himself, forcing his body to stay calm even as every instinct reminded him how close he was to something far beyond his understanding. "You should leave," she said again. But this time the words carried something different, not a command, not a warning, but something closer to consideration, and that alone was enough to make his chest tighten, because it meant she was thinking about him, about what might happen to him, and that was not something the stories had ever mentioned. Ethan shook his head once, small, controlled. "If I leave, it still happens," he replied, his eyes flicking to the unstable rhythm. Again, tracking it like he would a failing reactor core. "And I am guessing you do not have a backup system for this." A faint pause followed, just long enough to confirm he was right, and he felt a strange, quiet satisfaction in that. Not because he wanted to be correct, but because it meant there was still something he could do. He shifted his stance slightly, careful not to move too fast, then slowly reached toward the toolkit clipped at his belt, every motion deliberate, visible, giving her time to react if she chose to. But she did not move, did not stop him, only watched. That same intense focus now mixed with something else, something unfamiliar even to her. "I am going to take a closer look," he said, not asking permission, but not forcing it either, leaving the decision hanging in the space between them. And for a long second nothing happened, no movement, no response, just the quiet hum of the station and the faint, unstable rhythm beneath her skin. And then, almost imperceptibly, she shifted her stance, not stepping back, not lowering her guard completely, but opening just enough, a small, deliberate allowance that spoke louder than any words. Ethan felt it immediately, that subtle change, the way the tension in the air eased by a fraction, and he stepped forward, closing the remaining distance until he was standing within arm's reach, close enough now to see every detail, the fine patterns beneath her skin, the way the light moved unevenly across it, the exact point where the instability was strongest. His hand hovered for a moment, just inches from her side, and he paused, not because he was afraid, though he was, but because this was the line, the point where observation became action, where curiosity became responsibility, and he knew once he crossed it, there was no stepping back. "This might feel strange," he said quietly, the closest thing to a warning he could offer, and her eyes locked onto his, steady, searching, and after a heartbeat, she gave the smallest nod, barely there, but real, and that was enough. Ethan reached out, closing the final inch of space, and the moment his fingers made contact, he realized two things at once. First, that she was warmer than he expected, not surface heat, but something deeper, like energy held just beneath the skin, and second, that whatever was happening inside her was far more complex than he had imagined, because the pulse beneath his hand did not behave like any system he had ever worked on. It responded, shifting, adjusting, almost aware, and for the first time since he had stepped into Dock 17, Ethan understood that he was not just fixing a problem. He was touching something that had never been meant to be understood by someone like him. The moment his hand settled against her side, the world did not explode or collapse or react the way his instincts had prepared him for. Instead it narrowed, sharpened, every sensation pulling inward toward that single point of contact, and Ethan felt it immediately, the pattern beneath her skin shifting under his fingers, not randomly, not chaotically, but with a kind of response that felt disturbingly intentional. It was not like touching metal, not like touching anything engineered by human hands. There was no rigid structure, no predictable circuitry. Instead it felt layered, fluid in ways that defied the systems he understood, like energy moving through something alive, something aware of being observed. He drew in a slow breath, focusing, filtering out the way his pulse tried to spike again, because panic blurred details were everything right now. And as he adjusted the pressure of his hand slightly, the irregular rhythm reacted, tightening, then loosening, like it was testing him back, matching his movement with its own. "It is responding," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But she heard it, of course she did, her entire body going still in a way that felt less like control and more like concentration, as if she was listening to something deeper than sound. "That should not be possible," she replied, her voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge, and Ethan let out a faint breath. Almost a laugh, but not quite. "Yeah," he murmured. "I am getting that a lot today," his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked the subtle fluctuations beneath his hand, the way the pulse accelerated when he pressed too firmly, then stabilized when he eased back, like a feedback loop searching for balance. He shifted his stance, grounding himself, bringing his other hand up slowly, giving her time to stop him if she chose to. But she did not move, did not pull away, only watched him with that same intense focus. Except now there was something else layered into it, something fragile, something that looked dangerously close to trust. His second hand hovered for a fraction of a second before settling lightly near the first, and the effect was immediate. The unstable rhythm surged once, sharper, brighter, then settled into something more even, not perfect, not stable yet, but closer, like a system finally finding a point of equilibrium after too long running out of sync. Ethan felt it. In the air too, the pressure easing just slightly, the faint distortion around her form smoothing out, and he exhaled slowly, letting his shoulders drop a fraction as his mind began to map what he was feeling, not in terms of what it was, but what it was doing, because that was the only way he knew how to understand something this far outside his experience. "You are not breaking," he said after a moment, his voice steadier now, more certain. "You are compensating." The word felt strange, insufficient, but it was the closest he could get, and her eyes flickered at that. A brief flash of something that might have been recognition or disbelief or both. "Explain," she said, and this time it was not a command. It was a request, plain and direct, and that alone made something shift in Ethan's chest, because it meant she was choosing to listen, choosing to understand instead of react. He swallowed once, then focused back on the pattern beneath his hands. "Whatever this is," he said, slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It is not failing the way you think. It is trying to adjust, but it does not have enough input." He hesitated, then added, "It is like a system designed to run alone suddenly having to account for something new, and it does not know how yet." The explanation hung there, imperfect but honest, and for a long second she did not respond, her gaze fixed on him, searching, processing, and then, almost imperceptibly, her posture shifted again, not defensive, not closed, but open in a way that felt far more dangerous, because it meant she was allowing this, allowing him. And as the faint, unstable rhythm beneath his hands began to steady just a little more, Ethan realized with a quiet, unsettling clarity that this was no longer just about fixing something that was broken. It was about being part of something that was changing. The steadying rhythm beneath his hands did not just hold. It began to change, subtle at first, like a system learning a new pattern, adapting not because it was programmed to, but because it had no other choice, and Ethan felt it in real time. The way the energy shifted under his palms, less erratic, more aware, responding not just to pressure, but to presence. His breathing slowed without him realizing it, sinking unconsciously to the pattern he was tracking, and for a brief, strange moment, it felt less like he was fixing something and more like he was being allowed to stay. Her gaze had not left him, but the intensity had transformed, no longer sharp enough to cut, instead focused in a way that felt almost searching, as if she was trying to understand him the same way he was trying to understand her, and that realization sent a quiet tension through his chest, something deeper than fear, something closer to responsibility. You are influencing it, she said, her voice softer now. The edges of control still there, but no longer absolute. And Ethan shook his head slightly, his eyes still fixed on the shifting pattern beneath his hands. No, he replied, choosing his words carefully. I am just giving it something to work with. He paused, feeling the rhythm stabilize further, the fluctuations narrowing into something more consistent. It is doing the rest. And that seemed to land somewhere inside her, not as a contradiction, but as a possibility she had never considered. The air around them continued to ease, the faint distortions fading until the space felt almost normal again, if normal had ever applied to standing this close to someone like her. And Ethan became aware of something else, something quieter, the absence of tension where it had been constant. Before, the absence of resistance where he had expected it most. This has never happened, she said after a moment. And there was no uncertainty in the statement, only a quiet acknowledgement, and Ethan nodded once, because he believed her, not because he understood why, but because everything about this felt like it existed outside the rules she had lived by. He adjusted his hands slightly, testing the response again, and the pattern followed, not perfectly, but predictably enough to confirm what he had started to suspect, that whatever this was, it was not just reacting to his touch, it was reacting to his presence, to the fact that he was here, that he had not left, that he had chosen to stay when every logical path would have taken him away. You have always handled it alone, he said quietly, not as a question, but as a conclusion, and for the first time since he had met her. She did not answer immediately, her gaze dropping just slightly, not away from him, but inward, as if she was looking at something he could not see. The silence stretched, but it was different now, no longer heavy, no longer threatening. Instead it felt open, like a space waiting to be filled, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something new, something that did not belong to power or control or fear. Alone is efficient, she said, but the words did not hold the same weight they might have before, and Ethan let out a slow breath, almost a quiet sigh. Yeah, he murmured. Usually is. His eyes flicked up to meet hers again, steady, unguarded in a way he had not intended but could not take back. But it is not always stable. And that was it. The shift he could not undo, the line that had been crossed without either of them naming it. Because something in her expression changed again, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough for him to see it. Enough for him to know that for the first time, the most dangerous presence on the station was considering. Something she had never needed to consider before, not strength, not control, but the possibility that not everything had to be carried alone. For a moment, nothing moved except the quiet rhythm beneath his hands, steady now in a way that felt almost fragile, like it could hold if nothing disturbed it. And Ethan became aware of how close they were, not just in distance, but in something less measurable, something that had shifted without either of them naming it. The air no longer pressed against his lungs, the metallic tang fading into something softer, almost neutral. And he realized that the constant tension he had felt since stepping into Dock 17 had eased enough for him to think clearly again, which should have been a relief, but instead it left him with a different kind of unease, the kind that came when a problem stopped being dangerous and started being personal. His hands remained where they were, steady, light, careful not to disrupt the balance they had found, and he watched the pattern beneath his palms with the same focus he would give any system on the edge. Except this time the system was watching him back. Her gaze had softened further, not in weakness, not in surrender, but in something more complex, something that looked like she was no longer deciding whether he was a threat, but what he meant to the situation itself. It is quieter, she said, her voice almost uncertain, as if she did not fully trust the observation, and Ethan nodded slightly, eyes still tracking the steady rhythm. Yeah, he murmured. It is finding a balance. He hesitated, then added, or we are, because it did not feel like a one-sided process anymore. And that distinction mattered more than he expected. A faint flicker passed across her expression, subtle but real, and for a second he thought he saw something like confusion there, not the kind that came from lack of knowledge, but the kind that came from encountering something that did not fit any existing understanding. You are not afraid now, she said, and it was not a question. It was an observation, one that seemed to carry more weight than anything else she had said, and Ethan paused, considering it, feeling for the truth of it instead of giving an easy answer, because the easy answer would have been wrong. I am, he said finally, his voice quiet but honest, just not of you. His gaze lifted to meet hers fully, unguarded in a way he had not intended but could not take back. I am more worried about what happens if this goes wrong, and for a moment her eyes searched his, not for weakness, not for deception, but for something else entirely, something he could not quite name. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, layered with everything neither of them was saying, and Ethan felt it settle between them, not as tension, but as something steadier, something that did not need to be forced. The rhythm beneath his hands held, stronger now, more consistent, and he allowed himself a small, careful adjustment, testing it again, and the response came back smooth, stable, like a system that had finally accepted a new parameter and integrated it into its function. This is not how it was designed, she said after a while, and there was no judgment in it, only a quiet acknowledgement, and Ethan let out a soft breath, almost a smile touching the edge of his voice. Most things are not, he replied. They just figure it out as they go. His eyes flicked briefly to the steady pattern beneath his hands before returning to her, same as people. And that seemed to land deeper than anything else he had said, because her expression shifted again, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough for him to see the moment it happened. The moment she stopped treating this as an anomaly to be corrected and started seeing it as something that could exist, something that did not need to be controlled to be real. Her shoulders eased, just slightly, the rigid precision of her posture softening by a fraction, and the space between them changed again, not closing, not widening, but settling into something new, something that felt less like a standoff and more like a connection, fragile and unspoken but undeniably there. And as Ethan stood there, hands steady, breathing slow, he realized that whatever this was, whatever they had just stepped into, it was no longer something he could walk away from without leaving a part of it behind. The balance held, but it was no longer just a system stabilizing. It was something evolving, something adjusting beyond what either of them expected, and Ethan felt at the moment the rhythm beneath his hands shifted again, not into instability, but into something responsive in a new way, like it had started anticipating instead of reacting. His breath slowed further, almost unconsciously matching the steady pulse. And for the first time since stepping into Dock 17, he realized he was no longer bracing for something to go wrong. He was waiting to see what would happen next. Her gaze remained fixed on him, but the intensity had transformed again, no longer searching for threat or weakness. Instead it carried something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to recognition, and that unsettled him more than anything else had so far, because recognition meant change, and change meant neither of them fully understood where this was going. It is adapting to you, she said, her voice low, measured, but no longer distant, and Ethan shook his head slightly, though the words did not come as easily this time. Or maybe, he replied slowly, it is adapting to the fact that I am still here. Because that felt closer to the truth, and saying it out loud made something shift in his chest, something he was not ready to name. The air around them remained calm, the faint distortions completely gone now, replaced by a stillness that felt almost intentional, like the space itself had adjusted to accommodate this moment. And Ethan became aware of how unnatural that was, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that suggested this had not been meant to happen, not like this, not with someone like him. His hands remained steady, but his focus shifted slightly, no longer just tracking the pattern, but feeling it, the way it moved beneath his skin, the way it seemed to respond not just to pressure, but to presence, too. Attention, and that realization settled heavily in his mind, because it meant this was not something he could fix and walk away from. This was something that involved him whether he intended it or not. What happens when you leave? She asked suddenly, and the question cut through the quiet with a clarity that made his breath catch for just a second, not because of how it was asked, but because of what it implied. Because she was no longer asking what this was. She was asking what would happen. Without him, Ethan hesitated, the answer forming before he could stop it, but he forced himself to think it through anyway, because this mattered, more than any system he had ever worked on. It might hold for a while. he said carefully, his voice steady but quieter now. But if this is what I think it is going to drift again. His eyes lifted to meet hers fully, unflinching despite the weight of the moment. Because it is not just the system that changed. And that was the part he could not soften, could not avoid, because anything less would have been dishonest. The silence that followed was heavier than before, but not with tension, with understanding, the kind that settled slowly but completely. And he saw it in her expression, the way her eyes shifted, not away from him, but deeper into whatever conclusion she was reaching. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her stance open, but there was something else there now, something deliberate, something chosen, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before. Then you should not leave. And the words were simple, direct, without force or demand, but they carried more weight than anything else she had said, because they were not a command, they were a decision. And for the first time since he had met her, Ethan realized that the most dangerous being on the station was not asking him to stay, she was choosing to trust that he would. The words settled between them with a weight that did not need force to be understood, and Ethan felt it immediately, not as pressure, not as obligation, but as something quieter and far more dangerous, a choice that had already been made before he had the chance to respond. His hands remained steady against her side, the rhythm beneath them holding firm now, no longer fragile, no longer searching, but integrated in a way that felt stable enough to trust. And that should have been the end of it. The point where he stepped back, confirmed the system was no longer failing, and walked away like he always did. But nothing about this felt like any system he had ever worked on. His breath slowed as he lifted his gaze to meet hers fully, the distance between them unchanged but no longer guarded. And he realized that leaving now would not just be walking away from a problem, it would be undoing something that had already taken shape. You do not even know me, he said quietly, not as a refusal, but as a statement that needed to exist before anything else, and her eyes did not waver, the gold within them steady, focused, but no longer sharp. I know enough, she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no calculation, just a simple certainty that unsettled him more than any threat could have. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind moving through possibilities the way it always did, mapping outcomes, weighing risks, except this time the variables did not behave the way they should, because this was not just about what might happen to her system if he left. It was about what had already changed because he stayed. He shifted his hands slightly, testing the rhythm one more time, and it responded smoothly, consistently, no longer dependent on constant adjustment, but still aware, still linked to his presence in a way he could not ignore. This is not permanent, he said after a moment, his voice steady, grounded in the only certainty he could offer. It is stable now, but if whatever caused it is still there, it could drift again. And he saw the way her expression absorbed that, not resisting it, not dismissing it, just accepting it as part of the reality she was choosing to face. Then you will remain until it does not, she said. And again, it was not a command, not an expectation forced onto him. It was a conclusion, one she had already reached, and that was what made it difficult, because she was not trying to control him, she was trusting him to decide. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he looked at her, really looked this time. Not at the power she carried, not at the stories that followed her, but at the small, almost imperceptible shifts in her expression, the way her posture no longer held the same rigid distance, the way her presence no longer pushed him away but allowed him to exist within it. And he understood then that this was not about her needing him in the way a system needed a repair. This was about something else entirely, something neither of them had been built for. You are asking me to stay, he said. And the words felt heavier than they should have, because they carried more meaning than he was used to assigning. And for the first time since he had met her, she paused, just for a fraction of a second, enough for him to see it, the space between certainty and something else, something more vulnerable. And when she answered, her voice was quieter, not weaker, just different. I am asking you not to leave. And that was the difference, subtle but undeniable, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest in a way he could not dismiss, because it was not about control, not about necessity, it was about choice, hers and now his. The station remained silent around them, the hum of distant systems continuing as if nothing had changed, but Ethan knew better, because everything had, not in the structure of the station, not in the systems he understood, but in the space between two beings who were never supposed to meet like this. And as he stood there, hands steady, heart no longer racing but not entirely calm either, he realized that whatever decision he made next would not just determine what happened to her. It would define what this moment had meant in the first place. The choice did not arrive with clarity or certainty. It settled slowly, like pressure redistributing through something already under strain, and Ethan felt it in the quiet space between his thoughts, in the way his body did not pull back, did not step away, even when every logical part of him listed the reasons he should. His hands remained where they were, steady against her side, the rhythm beneath them no longer demanding constant attention, but still present, still connected in a way he could not ignore, and he realized that the moment for deciding had already passed, not when she asked, but when he chose not to leave the first time. He let out a slow breath, the air steady in his lungs, grounding himself in something familiar, something he understood, even if everything else around him had shifted beyond recognition. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same grounded certainty. "I am already here." And it was not an answer, not exactly, but it was enough. Her gaze held his, searching, not for agreement, not for submission, but for something deeper, something that would confirm what she had already begun to believe. And for the first time, he did not look away, did not deflect. He let the moment exist exactly as it was, unguarded and unresolved. The station remained quiet, the distant hum of systems continuing as if nothing had changed. But Ethan could feel the difference, not in the air, not in the structure, but in the way his presence no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt accepted. The rhythm beneath his hands shifted again, but this time it did not destabilize. It expanded, subtle but undeniable, like a system no longer constrained by its original limits, and he felt it move beyond the point of contact, spreading through her in a way that was no longer localized, no longer isolated to a single imbalance, and his breath caught slightly as he realized what that meant. "It is holding," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But she heard it. Of course she did, and her posture eased further, the last remnants of rigid control giving way to something more fluid, more natural, as if the constant effort to contain something had finally been reduced. "No," she replied, her voice calm, steady, but carrying a depth that had not been there before. "It is not holding." And he felt the shift in her words before he understood them. "It is changing," and that landed differently, not as a correction, but as a realization, one that aligned too closely with what he had been feeling to ignore. Ethan swallowed once, his mind trying to map something that no longer followed any structure he recognized, because this was not a system stabilizing. It was something adapting in real time. Something integrating variables it had never been designed to account for, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that he was one of those variables. "That is not how systems are supposed to work," he said, almost under his breath, and she tilted her head slightly, the motion softer now, less precise, more human. "Then perhaps it is not a system," she said, and the simplicity of it cut through everything he had been trying to analyze, because it removed the one framework he had been relying on to make sense of this. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of that realization, of everything it implied, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest, not as fear, not as resistance, but as something heavier, something that carried weight without force. His hands remained steady, but his focus shifted, no longer trying to fix or adjust, but simply present, simply there. And the rhythm beneath them continued, steady, consistent, no longer reacting to instability, but maintaining something new, something that did not need constant correction. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly, and the question held no challenge, no suspicion, only curiosity, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the answer coming easier than he expected. "Nothing," he said, and for the first time since this began, that was true. He was not fixing, not adjusting, not intervening. He was just there, and somehow, that was enough. Her eyes softened by a fraction, the smallest shift, but enough for him to see it, enough for him to understand that whatever this was, it did not require control, it required presence. And as the steady rhythm continued beneath his hands, unchanged and yet entirely different, Ethan realized that the decision he thought he had to make had already been made the moment he chose not to walk away, and now, all that remained was to stay. The stillness between them deepened, not as an absence of motion, but as a presence of something settled, something that no longer needed to prove itself through force or resistance. And Ethan felt it in the way his body no longer anticipated disruption, in the way his breathing remained slow and even without effort, as if whatever tension had once filled this space had finally dissolved into something quieter, something stable. His hands rested lightly where they were, no longer adjusting, no longer testing, simply there, and the rhythm beneath them continued without interruption, steady and consistent in a way that felt less like a system maintaining function and more like something choosing to remain as it was. Her gaze had not shifted, but it had changed, not in intensity, but in meaning, the sharp edges of calculation replaced by something that felt present, aware in a way that extended beyond observation. And Ethan realized that she was not just watching him anymore, she was experiencing the moment alongside him. "This is new," she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that did not need emphasis, and Ethan nodded slightly, because there was no other way to describe it, not in terms he understood, not in terms that fit into any framework he had relied on before. The station around them continued its distant hum, the soft vibration of systems operating far beyond their immediate space. But here, in this section of Dock 17, everything felt isolated, contained within the boundaries of this moment, as if the rest of the world had simply stepped back to allow it to exist. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not to move away, but to adjust his stance, and even that small change seemed to register, not as disruption, but as part of the ongoing balance, the rhythm beneath his hands adapting seamlessly, no longer fragile, no longer reactive, but integrated in a way that felt natural. "It is not dependent anymore," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful, measured, as if speaking too loudly might break something delicate, and her eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus. "Explain," she said, and again, it was not a demand. It was a request, one she had chosen to make. Ethan drew in a slow breath, considering how to put something into words that barely made sense even in his own mind. "Before, it needed constant correction," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to the steady pattern beneath his hands before returning to her. "Now it is maintaining itself." He hesitated, then added, "It learned." And the word felt insufficient, too simple for what was actually happening. But it was the closest he could get. Her expression shifted again, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough for him to see the moment it connected, the moment something aligned within her understanding. And when she spoke, her voice carried a depth that had not been there before. "It did not learn alone," she said, and the statement was quiet, but absolute, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest with a weight he could not ignore, because she was not just acknowledging the change, she was acknowledging his place within it. He exhaled slowly, the air steady, grounding him in something real as his mind tried to process what that meant, because this was no longer about fixing a problem or stabilizing a system. This was about something shared, something that had formed between them without either of them intending it, and that made it far more complex than anything he had dealt with before. His hands remained where they were, but his focus shifted again, no longer tracking, no longer analyzing, just present, just aware, and the rhythm beneath them continued without fluctuation, strong, consistent, no longer needing anything from him to remain that way. And yet he did not pull away. "You can step back," she said after a moment, and there was no urgency in it, no expectation, just a simple acknowledgement of possibility. And Ethan paused, the words registering, the option existing clearly in front of him for the first time since this began, and he realized that he could leave now, that whatever had been unstable was no longer dependent on his presence, that the system, whatever it truly was, would hold without him. But he did not move, his hands remaining where they were for just a second longer, not out of necessity, not out of obligation, but because stepping back now felt like leaving something unfinished, something unspoken. And when he finally did move, it was slow, deliberate, his hands lifting away with care, not because it required it, but because he chose to treat it that way. And the moment the contact broke, The rhythm did not falter, did not shift. It remained exactly as it was, steady, unchanged, and that told him everything he needed to know. The space between them widened by inches, but it did not feel like distance. It felt like something defined, something acknowledged, and when he met her gaze again, there was no tension there, no uncertainty, just a quiet understanding that had not existed before, and in that moment, Ethan realized that whatever had changed here was not something that could be undone by stepping away, because it was no longer contained within the space between his hands and her skin. It existed beyond that now, in a place neither of them had words for, but both of them understood. The space between them remained open, quiet, no longer defined by distance or tension, but by something far less tangible, something that did not need to be measured to be understood, and Ethan stood there, hands now at his sides, feeling the absence of contact in a way that was not empty, but complete. The rhythm he had felt beneath his palms still existed, not physically, not in any way he could touch, but he could sense it, like an echo that had settled into the air itself, steady and unwavering. No longer something fragile, no longer something that needed him to hold it together. And that realization should have brought relief, but instead it carried a weight he had not expected. She did not move, did not close the distance again, but her presence remained just as strong, just as clear, except now it no longer pressed against him, it existed alongside him, and that difference changed everything. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since he had stepped into Dock 17, there was no question in them, no calculation, no guarded distance, only a quiet certainty that felt more real than anything else that had happened here. "It remains," she said, her voice calm, steady, not testing, not doubting, simply acknowledging what was already true, and Ethan nodded once, because there was nothing else to say to that, nothing that would add to what they both already understood. The station around them continued its distant hum, systems running, lights flickering softly along the walls, but none of it seemed to reach this space, as if this moment existed outside of everything else, separate, untouched, and for a second, Ethan wondered how long it would stay that way, how long before reality pressed back in and forced everything to return to what it had been before. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was already too late for that, because something had changed, not in the station, not in the systems, but in the way they stood there now, no longer strangers divided by fear, no longer opposites defined by distance, but something else entirely, something that had no clear definition, only presence. He shifted his weight slightly. The movement small, almost unnoticeable, but this time it did not alter anything, did not disrupt the balance they had found, and that alone told him how complete the change had been, because before, even the smallest movement would have mattered. "You were wrong," she said after a moment, and there was no accusation in it, only quiet correction, and Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, the faintest hint of curiosity breaking through the stillness. "About what?" he asked, his voice calm, grounded. And she held his gaze, unflinching. "You said it would drift," she replied, and he felt the weight of that, the implication behind it, the quiet acknowledgement that whatever this was had gone beyond his understanding, beyond his expectations, and for once, he did not try to explain it, did not try to fit it into something logical. Instead, he let out a slow breath, the corners of his mouth shifting just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "Yeah," he admitted softly. "I did." And the honesty of it settled between them without resistance, without the need for correction or defense. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said and everything that had not, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest, not as tension, not as uncertainty, but as something steady, something real. She stepped forward then, just once, closing a small part of the distance that remained, not enough to touch, not enough to return to what had been, but enough to change the shape of the space between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said. The light along her skin shifted subtly, not with instability, not with strain, but with something that looked almost natural, and Ethan realized that whatever had once defined her, whatever had made others fear her, was no longer the only thing that existed, because now there was something else there too, something quieter, something chosen. His gaze held hers, steady, unguarded, and in that final, silent moment, he understood something that had nothing to do with systems or logic or anything he had ever learned, something simple and undeniable, that he had not stayed because he had to. He had stayed because he chose to, and somehow, that had been enough. He was not a soldier, not a hero, not someone meant to change the course of anything larger than his own life. But standing there, in the quiet aftermath of something neither of them had expected, he realized that none of that had mattered, because in the end, he had not fixed a system, he had not solved a problem, he had simply remained when it would have been easier to leave, and that, more than anything else, had changed everything.